Look, it is a pleasure to follow on from Sue Moroney and her contribution on this bill, because I think it's widely acknowledged that the huge amount of debate and discussion on paid parental leave that we are rightly having in this Parliament has in large part been driven by Sue Moroney and the Labour Party who have supported her in that campaign. And I think we're all, even though we've been unable to reach consensus on elements of paid parental leave, most notably that the Labour Party still believes, obviously, that 26 weeks is ideal. And actually, to a certain extent, I believe that the National Party probably agrees that it's ideal, probably. Maybe I'm being a touch generous, but have continued to argue that in their minds, the numbers, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't add up. Well, that's where we have a definite difference in opinion. On this side of the House, we believe it's one of those investing to save when it comes to investing in mums and babies, that we all benefit from that investment as a society. So there is still, obviously, as much as we are very pleased to see some of these amendments today, I think it is still important to use the opportunity to say, look, we would have been happy if Part 1 had an extension of time, if we were at that ultimate of 26 weeks, because it is what the international evidence and advice suggests to us that we should be pursuing. And as a party, and of course, because we fundamentally believe in that, we will still be pushing amendments that make that point. And you never know, perhaps David Seymour might like to support that again. And perhaps also on multiple births as well, an issue that we still have concerns around. This is the point that I always pay tribute to my nana, who had not just one multiple birth, but 2 multiple births within a period of 4 years. I challenge anyone not to grimace at the idea of having 4 children of that age, 2 multiple births, and keep your sanity at the same time. So there are obvious reasons why we continue to push that, whilst we've acknowledged again the need for support for those pre-term, that's where we'd like to see those extra provisions go in terms of 26 weeks as well. I want to come to some of the amendments, because in reading the commentary, I'm not a member of the Transport Industrial Relations Select Committee, but in reading some of the amendments that they've made, you can tell that a lot of good work has been done via this Select Committee. A huge number of submissions, 12,260 submissions on this bill. And a number of those, of course, would have related to the 0-hour contract elements of the bill, which we will come to, but Part 1 doesn't cover that. Part 1 is focused on parental leave and payment entitlements. But you can see by that work that there has been thorough consideration. And I want to come first of all then to Clause 16 in Part 1, where the Select Committee has considered the fact that this bill broadens out eligibility to the term primary carer. Because, of course, before the test under the law has had some constraints in terms of who's able to access parental leave provisions: biological mothers, spouses, partners, formal adoptive parents. But primary carer does broaden the eligibility to individuals who assume primary, non-temporary responsibility for raising a child. Now, I think we have to acknowledge that in New Zealand now, in our modern family structures, we do often have a range of arrangements when it comes to the care of a child. And we do need to make sure that those who are in that primary care role are able to access paid parental leave provisions. I can think of some constituency cases where children have been whāngai, and it may not have been a formal arrangement, but we would want that individual, for instance, it makes sense for them to be eligible for these provisions. And in fact, the research does tell us now that as much of course, biological parents have a significant role, obviously, by default, that actually the most important thing is the ability of a newborn to form a bond with a consistent primary carer in their life. And that the label of that carer is not the relevant part in terms of that that relationship that that child is able to form with that primary carer, Mr Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So I do think that the Select Committee was right to broaden out that term. We wouldn't want to exclude individuals, but we have to make sure that we're careful that it doesn't go so broad that we're including people, for instance, who are home care providers, for instance, the Paws of this world, would not want to be eligible in that regard. So I think probably making sure that that isn't the case is certainly advisable. It's those who have that permanent carer role. I want to come on to the additional entitlements for primary carers of preterm babies. And of course, obviously, as Sue Moroney has already laid out, the additional leave payment entitlements for primary carers of premature babies born before the end of the 36th week of gestation is a welcome amendment to this bill for all of the reasons that she outlined. And of course, that was at the point that we realised we weren't going to achieve 26 weeks. You know, at that point, it was about trying to have the maximum effect for those who needed it most. So it really was the politics of opposition, recognising that there was a difference that still could be made for those who really needed it, even if we weren't going to reach our goal. Just, I think, for the sake of clarity, it is worth pointing out the way that the Select Committee determined that that should be accessed, which is set out in section 71DA and then consequential amendments. So the way that that's structured will allow primary carers 1 week of preterm baby payment for each week that their child was born prematurely to a maximum of 13 weeks. The payment would end when the primary carer returned to work or at the end of the week that would have been the 36th week of gestation, whichever comes first. And I think it's really important to note that, of course, you know, a parent who has a premature baby is much more likely, of course, to experience longer periods with that child in hospital. I've had a friend not that long ago who experienced that exact situation, and the absolute chaos that then ensued for that family. It was extraordinarily difficult to balance both caring and being present for that baby while it was in hospital, but also care arrangements for the remainder of the family, of course, who were at home. And then under usual terms, that would eat into the ability of that parent to then have that longer period post-birth with the usual PPL provisions. This is a practical measure that can be taken to assist those families who are not experiencing the same start for them and their family and their new baby in life as those who are going full term. It acknowledges that those babies are at greater risk and that there is that additional pressure for those families. So I think it's an excellent amendment that we're seeing. And once again, I pay tribute to Sue Moroney in particular and acknowledge that the role of MMP sometimes, well, not sometimes, but should be all the time in this House, the ability of individual smaller parties to recognise when there is something that, regardless of a relationship they might have, coalition or the relationship they might have with the governing party, that on the merits of amendments that are put forward in this House, regardless of which party produces them, deserve support. It would have been helpful if that could have just been done at the time that the bill came forward, in the name of the member that it came forward with, putting that politics aside. If that individual member thinks that it's a good idea, it should be backed. Putting that aside, we now are at a situation where we have the ability to support that collectively. I wouldn't want to add up the numbers of families who have missed out because of that little bit of politics, though, because ultimately there will be a number who won't receive the assistance that this bill offers them because a party who has been named chose not to support it at the time that it came up, but to wait. So that is a shame. But look, ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we celebrate the progress that is being made whilst continuing to advocate for what the international evidence supports, and that is 26 weeks for babies. 26 weeks for babies, because they are the ultimate ones that will benefit from the ability of that primary carer to be there with that child. Ultimately, we always, of course, support the idea of that being mum for breastfeeding reasons. That's why we've always pushed for 26 weeks, but acknowledging the range of circumstances that come into play, such as whāngai adoption. So, Mr. Speaker, very supportive of those amendments.